Welcome to Canadians for the Rule of Law's third webinar, Investigating the Interference and Influence of Foreign Actors on the Canadian and Political Social Scene and its Impact on Rule of Law. I'm your moderator for the evening, Christine Douglas-Williams. We thank you for tuning in. Also, a special thank you to our sponsors, the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation, Mantua Books, the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, the Lawfare Project, and Mazood. Now for our topic. The infiltration of foreign players in Canada is not remote. At a grassroots level, it affects your daily life, whether or not you may realize it, not to mention your future, your children and your grandchildren's future, the trajectory of our nation, its freedoms and rule of law. Our organization is committed to rule of law. It is founded on Canada's Constitution. It is our backbone and security. Rule of law is predicated on transparency and on due process, which brings us to the threat of foreign influences. The impact of foreign influences can be subversive, which insidiously erodes and threatens to delegitimize rule of law. Our expert panel today will enlighten you on the presence and impact of such forces. Influential foreign players are very much at work in our midst. Before I introduce our panelists, a note to our audience. After you hear them speak, you'll be given an opportunity to ask your questions. We ask that you type them into the box, and our Q&A moderator, Anita Bromberg, will take them. Now for our first guest, Gerard Filitti, Senior Counsel at the Lawfare Project. Gerard has broad experience in commercial and complex litigation across a wide variety of practice areas in both state and federal courts. He recently pursued civil counterterrorism litigation and an emphasis on money laundering investigations, and represented victims of international acts of terrorism in litigation brought under the Anti-Terrorism Act, the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, and the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. Gerard is also author of the book, Frozen Tide, a terrorism thriller. Gerard, thank you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you, Christine, and thank you to my fellow panelists, and thank you to all of our sponsors for hosting this tremendously important panel. We can't turn on the news without seeing the events in the world and how they affect us, both in the United States and Canada. Part of that effect is felt in what we see in our own society. And whether we like it or not, what we see is very much influenced by foreign actors who provide funding and other influence operations within our borders. Any economy, especially developed economies, are long subject to foreign countries trying to exert influence, whether it's to acquire information or intelligence that may benefit them, or to change a narrative or influence politicians into favorable trade deals or favorable political relations. This is normal. What's not normal is when these relationships are obscured, when the purpose is hidden, when the money is not declared, and we simply don't know whether the speech that we're hearing from our journalists, from our academic institutions, from our community leaders is native to our borders and respects our values, or is bought and paid for by a foreign power. This is tremendously important, as we've seen in recent years with China, with Russia. China is a power that is using its influences both to subvert our freedoms in terms of what work product we put out there, our freedoms of speech and expression. We shared among ourselves recently an article, thank you, Christine, about how movies, even Hollywood blockbusters, are being affected by Chinese influence. We can't show certain things in the Chinese market. We make self-editing decisions based on content that other people might find objectionable because of that influence that they exert. With Russia, we see malign influence at work now with the invasion of Ukraine. We see internet activity that's not reflective of our values. That's really an influence operation conducted by the Russian government. From the Middle East, we've seen for many decades Saudi influence going into universities, both to obtain technology and to train engineering students to work the oil fields and petroleum exploration, but also to buy influence in favorable relationships, to get Congress and the parliament to provide them with the latest in technology for military weapons. More recently, we see influences from Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, who are in many ways subverting our democratic values through influence operations in the media. We see Al Jazeera, which is an arm of the Qatari government that presents news in a very biased manner that's not reflective of necessarily of our values and our principles of freedom and democratic values. All of this is also carried through not just at the government level, but at the university level, at academia. This is of concern to a lot of us because when students go to campus, they don't know whether what they're experiencing is the full range of academic freedoms that we're used to, or whether it's being moderated and influenced by foreign powers. We see a rise in anti-Semitism on college campuses, for example, which coincides with foreign money coming in. Is that money funding the anti-Semitism? Is it impacting what our students are learning? The hostile environment that's being created by activists on campus, are those activists being funded by foreign powers, or is it just a problem that we have within our own society? The problem is, for a lot of these questions, we don't really have answers because there is very little transparency when it comes to the money coming in from foreign countries. In the United States, it's a little bit easier. We have something called the Foreign Agent Registration Act. This is a law that requires foreign agents to register when they do certain activities on behalf of a foreign principal, activities that involve political activities, lobbying, public relations, anything having to do with attempting to influence elections and public opinion. So it's easier in the United States to require registration and disclosure when entities like Al Jazeera, which is a government-controlled entity, come into the market. It's easier to require under something called the Higher Education Act, universities to disclose what money they're getting from foreign sources. But even when we have these laws, there's still a big problem of enforcement. Enforcement is not just uniform, but loopholes in the law prevent accurate reporting. As Michael has done tremendous research showing, and he will talk about this, I'm sure, showing how much money has been underreported from foreign sources. So the problem is not just that we're getting a tremendous amount of money coming into our academics, to our academia. We don't know the full extent of it because in part, it's a matter of following the money, but we can't follow the money when we don't know where it's coming from. To give one example in a hypothetical so as not to offend any sensitive people who are very litigious, money doesn't always come directly from a foreign government. It sometimes goes through pass-through entities, through corporations that are set up much as a friendship society or an entity that is meant to promote the interests of a foreign country. Technically, those may not be controlled directly by the foreign government, but make no mistake, that's what they are. These are entities located in Washington, D.C., in Ottawa, in Toronto, in Montreal. Their main interest is following the policy guidance from foreign governments. But because they're not identified explicitly as being controlled by a foreign power, they don't register. So when a university gets money from one of these organizations, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. They may not know they're getting foreign money, but they should. And when they do know, it's easy not to report it because it's not on a list of registered agents. So there are flaws in the registration system in the United States. These prevent a full and accurate accounting and prevent transparency. In Canada, much as I hate to say it, the situation is even worse. There is no equivalent to the Higher Education Act that requires universities to report what they get from foreign countries. There's also no equivalent to the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The closest thing is a bill that was just read for the first time in February, an act to establish the Foreign Influence Registry. Unlike in America, where this activity is more broad-based and goes to anything having to do with policy or attempts to influence public opinion, in Canada, this would only require registration of people who essentially facilitate communications with elected officials. You would not need to register, for example, if what you do is funnel money to a university or to a benevolent society or to a mosque or to a church or to a religious group or anywhere else. Registration would be strictly limited to people who facilitate communications with government leaders. That's a start, but it's not enough. The problem that we see is that the lack of transparency allows actors to get a hold in our society. We see our next generation of leaders being influenced on college campuses. They're influenced by classes and by professors who present views that, yes, they're meant to challenge students, but sometimes they go to the point where we wonder if they reflect our democratic values. And when that happens, and when those universities receive hundreds of millions of dollars from foreign governments, many of which are undemocratic or anti-democratic, the problem is whether we can trust what comes out of academia and whether we can trust that the next generation of leaders will accurately and faithfully follow the democratic values and principles that we have. Thank you.
Our next guest is Dr. Aurel Braun, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto. He was recently a visiting professor in the Department of Government at Harvard University. He continues as a Center Associate of the Davis Center at Harvard. Dr. Braun is also a senior member of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies. Dr. Braun is also past Governor and Counsel appointee in Canada. He specializes in international law, communist affairs, and the problems of transformation of the socialist systems in the former Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. Aurel has authored several books, including the most recent, NATO-Russia Relations in the 21st Century. Aurel's full bio can be seen on our website. His focus this evening is on Russian influence. Thank you, Dr. Braun. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Christine, for that very generous introduction. And let me pick up from the very last line in the excellent presentation by my fellow panelist, when Gerard said, we don't know if we can trust what comes out of the academic world. And I would say you should not trust it in the best of circumstances, because we should vet everything. And academics would put out a great many ideas. And often there's not a direct connection with reality. But that general issue aside, we do have a very significant problem in the academic world, perhaps even more so in Canada than in the US. And I want to sort of tie this to Russia and how does Russia come in, because it is not a clear, linear, or obvious connection. Now, we know Russia is engaged currently not only in a horrific war in Ukraine, a war of aggression, but it is also conducting a frontal assault on international law, as well as on international institutions. We know as well that Russia has consistently tried to interfere in elections in countries around the world, and that there have been many instances in Canada. One study showed more than several thousand instances where they have tried in one form or another to have some kind of influence. But I think it's also easy to overestimate some of this. So I would not suggest by any means that Russian interference in elections has been determinative of the outcome, because there's so many other variables. And I think there has been an exaggeration of that impact. At the same time, we do not adequately understand the other forms of influence that Russia has had that are nefarious, that are insidious, that are ongoing. Now, Russia is a remnant of the Soviet Union. Russia is not a superpower except for nuclear weapons. Nonetheless, Russia is causing an enormous amount of harm in various ways. But we need to, in a sense, go back to the Soviet Union to understand the harm that Russia is doing today and what is happening on campuses. The BDS movement on campus is very strong, and it has leached out into the outer world. We also have something called Israeli Apartheid Week, and the term apartheid, which is a term in international law, it is one that indicates a terrible criminality. A country that is an apartheid state is illegitimate, and those who are in any way associated with it, those who support such a criminal entity, are accessories to one of the worst crimes in international law, the crime of apartheid. And so where does Russia come into this? In 1975, as the Soviet Union, Russia pushed, with the help of Arab countries, a resolution to the United Nations. This resolution, which was United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379, declared fundamentally that Zionism was racism. The national liberation movement of the Jewish people was deemed to be an act of racism. Consequently, Israel was illegitimate. Its supporters were accessories to that illegitimacy. As the Soviet Union began to transform itself, glasnost, perestroika, and as it came to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, this resolution was revoked in 1991. But then you see the replacement of this through something called the Durban Review Conference, initially called a Program of Action at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance. This was the title. It was, in fact, in 2001, a gigantic hate fest that focused heavily on Israel and its supporters around the world. This was followed by 3 other conferences: 2009, Durban 2, 2011, Durban 3, and the most recent one, 2021, Durban 4. All of the themes were basically the same. The replacement of this resolution, Zionism is racism, with another assault, which used the term apartheid. And at every one of these, Russia was a key supporter. Russia played a nefarious role. Russia doesn't just intervene directly. Russia has an impact by shielding and protecting some of the most vicious proponents of hate around the world. Iran, for example, is a close ally of Russia. The Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad, one of the most murderous regimes, has been saved largely by Vladimir Putin. Hezbollah, Hamas all receive a great deal of aid from Russia. Now the Soviet Union is gone. And then we see these organizations engage in lawfare. We see various organizations where we can't establish the ties, because I think the previous speaker explained very clearly that we don't have in Canada a Foreign Agents Registration Act, so we don't often know exactly what the financing is. But we can see that there are forms of lawfare. We can see on campuses. It was at the University of Toronto in 2005 that we see the beginning of Israeli apartheid. This is where it started. And this is an example of how we really need to look for early warning signs, because some of us try to fight that. Some of us try to go to the administration at the University of Toronto. We try to go to the organized Jewish community to point out that this was a very dangerous development. And this was dismissed as a one-off, that it was just some kind of student event, that this was insignificant, and the more publicity we would give them, the more oxygen they would have. In fact, this was a very well-coordinated propaganda effort that has continued, that has now spilled over to a vast number of countries, a huge number of universities. It is a yearly hate fest that seeks to delegitimize anyone who in any way supports Israel. And in certain manifestations, this attack on Zionism has become anti-Semitism. A liberal prime minister, not some right-wing conservative, but a liberal prime minister has come out, like Mr. Justin Trudeau said, BDS is anti-Semitic. And this is the view of most leaders of democratic states. This is why by the time we came to Durban 4, something like 37 countries boycotted. Virtually every single democracy did not participate in Durban 4. But on campuses, we have not done enough. And so the Russian influence, which is part of information warfare, which is part of propping up the most nefarious regimes, the most important supporter of terrorism, Iran, one of the most vicious regimes, Syria, one of the worst terrorist groups, Hezbollah, another one, Hamas, various NGOs that are associated with some of these movements. These are helped by Russia. We are therefore suffering for those indirect effects. We often do not recognize the early warning signs. And often what happens on campuses is what I call, and I wrote about this together with David Matas, the Zionist exception, that campuses have become places where you have the least amount of freedom of speech. Every single group is protected except Jews who support Israel. So you can say things that may be profoundly anti-Semitic as long as you use the term Zionist instead of Jew. As you attach it to Israel, then you can just rejig images that should have died with various right-wing forms of extremism decades ago. Now they're coming on the left, and Russia has a part in this. So when we look at Qatar, when we look at various other proponents of these kind of actions, we can see Russia's hand in that. And that's what we need to be wary about. Often we are focused on the wrong thing with Russia, election interference. Not that it's insignificant, but that's not where they have the greatest impact. But through these various networks, through shielding the worst violators of international law, you have a Russia where a regime is pursuing terrible repression at home, and they are trying to do that with impunity and are succeeding because they're a nuclear power, and they are pursuing these shielding of these worst violators of human rights, and they have engaged Russia in naked aggression because they enjoy international immunity. So you have this melding of domestic impunity with international immunity because Russia is a member, a permanent member of the Security Council, which has the veto. So that's why we have to look at this information warfare that Russia has engaged in all of its forms, of the various links that they have with all these other groups. And it is only then that we begin to see how what is happening on campus is not accidental, it is not minor, it is not just student-led, but it is something that is far more insidious, and it does leach out. And we can see this. Those who are in the corporate world are beginning to see this, sometimes in the form of wokeness. And this is not to reject that there have been injustices. We want to remedy injustices. We want to address those discriminatory elements in the past. We all know democracies are imperfect. But Churchill, when he said, you know, Russia used the very colorful language, it's an enigma, it is a mystery, it is a riddle. It is not, with due respect, and I'm a great admirer of Churchill. Russia is a rogue state associated with other rogue states that is doing damage to democracy, that is doing it through conspiratorial means. It undermines transparency, it undermines predictability, it undermines due process. In other words, it undermines the rule of law. So if we believe in democracy, we believe in the rule of law, we have to look at Russia as an extremely negative element in the international system. I think my time is up. I will end here, and I will try to answer questions.
Thank you kindly, Professor Braun. Of course, those questions are going to come later on, but we could see a real theme here building between what Gerard has already said, what you just said, and what we'll hear Michael continue to say as well right now, because he's our next guest. So I'm going to introduce Michael. He's a certified public accountant who has held senior financial positions with Canadian and US corporations. He has focused much attention on the foreign funding of our academic institutions, which translates into many policies that we now see ruling our campuses, not always conducive to democratic rule of law, fairness, and safety for all. We're certainly well aware of the BDS drives and intimidating protests, and which sometimes become hostile against Jewish students and Zionist supporters. Gerard and Aurel touched on this. Michael is a longtime activist, born in Johannesburg. He was active in anti-apartheid activities in South Africa before immigrating to Canada. He's now a strong supporter of Israel as he engages in research on campus anti-Semitism, including presenting to the Knesset, universities, and intel groups in Israel. He's also on several boards which focus on Holocaust education and countering anti-Semitism. Thank you, Michael. You can go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Christine. I'd like to thank Gerard for his overview on what is going on the campuses. It's important to know that the US has a federal law because that's the way the education system is governed, regarding foreign funding reporting. $40 billion to date has been reported by colleges, and that, as we know, was not the full picture. I was able to find $3 billion alone a few years ago, specifically from Canada, that hadn't been reported. So we've got China, Canada, and Saudi Arabia, three of the main funders. Saudi Arabia has 2.6 billion, China 2.5 billion, and Canada about $5 billion. This is important because these three are the most important elements of nations that I see on the Canadian side. Canada, having a provincial administration of education, has no such reporting system. So it's an absolute blank sheet. Everything they do is undercover. Nobody knows what funding is coming in, and the funding is crucial. It's critical. Stats Canada reporting is the only thing we have, and without being mean to Stats Canada, I don't think too many people take the reporting that seriously. There's no checks and balances. All that is shown by Stats Canada reporting on an annual basis from foreign funding to Canada, to Canadian universities, is 180 million, which is less than 0.5% of the total revenue that they take in. So without a doubt, that's underfunded, underreported, the funding. It's very likely, well, it's hard to say what it is, and that's the problem. I've seen numerous reports, some of which I'll deal with briefly, discussing all the issues facing Canada. Not one of them has any financial information. And everything is governed by finance. Whatever China is doing is based on the influence they've obtained through their funding. In the US, it's influence funding. Everything there has been influence funding, and all the $40 billion they've taken in and more. Canada, the influence funding is taking place, but it's not being reported, it's not being analyzed, and nobody knows. It's a big black hole, unfortunately. I've seen 2 or 3 examples in numerous articles of actual funding amounts mentioned. $1.5 million going to Toronto's university, another 700,000 going to Queen's University, all from Chinese companies that deal with neural psychology and voice recognition systems. And I'll go into more detail of what they've actually been involved in. There's another instance of a Hong Kong billionaire who provided a huge amount, apparently, because we don't know the amount was never disclosed. The reason for it was never disclosed, and no information was obtained. This gentleman is a member of one of the Communist Party of China's administration committees. He holds a senior position. So he was personally putting this money in, and it went to the University of Alberta. Neither they nor he or anybody else has any information or will give any information. Huawei, we know, apparently, although they've been shut down now, had given 56 million to Canadian universities. Again, no details, not sure who they are, what they are, or if it was the full amount. CADA, we've heard lots about CADA from previous 2 gentlemen. CADA is a supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood, supports terror groups, and is a huge funder. Huge funder. We've seen that, nearly $6 billion in total in the US and unknown amounts in Canada. There are only 2 or 3 Canadian campuses that are active in Doha, but whatever they are doing is being fully funded by Qatar, maybe the Qatar Foundation. But again, no information. In the financial statements, all they say is we have a campus in Doha, and everything we spend is repaid to us, and they don't have to pay rent, and they get an administration fee on top of it. Saudi Arabia has been responsible for funding of a number of extremist private schools. We've had previous reports from people known to some of the people on this call that disclosed what was going on at these schools, the type of indoctrination. We've got another case that is a little strange, where we've got a Canadian University, Wilfrid Laurier, partnering with a major college in the US, Georgetown, on the Bridge Initiative. And that is to do with the fake Islamophobia, which is really a mechanism of deflecting criticism, of legitimate criticism of what is going on with Islamists in Canada and obviously in the rest of North America. Now, this is, I mean, in this case, America is a foreign influence. which is aiding the group in Canada. I've had a number of reports, and some of these I could share later with the group. Some by joint reports by RCMP and CSIS, who are really trying to be on top of this, but without funding information, nobody really knows, and they certainly don't know either. Nobody knows how much money is coming in and what it's doing. There was one that CSIS has considered that the Chinese government is using legal and legitimate businesses to gain control of Canada's economic levers. The money has to be huge. The things they are doing, they've taken control almost of a number of campuses. And we have cases where academia have been, let's say, recruited by China. They have a thing called the talent plans, and the talent plans go out and they recruit and buy and induce and entice academia and colleges to work with them so that they can steal Canadian military secrets and various other things to do with surveillance. Confucius Institutes were operating in Canada and the US. They were fronts for the Communist Party. They were seen as just spy satellites, even though they had children in there, they were teaching them, they were private schools. They were funded in the US by 766 million campuses that had a Confucius Institute. And the only reason they would be giving money to those colleges is because they had these Confucius Institutes that were acting as fronts for the Communist Party. Again, no information in Canada, not even the $1 worth of information as to how much has come into those campuses in Canada. The Australian Policy Institute has found Canadian universities, 3 of them, U of T, Waterloo, and McGill, are 3 of the 10 most involved with China on collaboration on scientific and research matters in the world. So they've had 687 papers which have been co-authored with Canada and Chinese academia. And generally, the academia from Canada are providing information that goes back to China to aid China in their military ambitions and their military growth and various other things. I have a report that outlines the kinds of things which it's important to people to know what's going on. China's military scientists and companies have established relationships with all Canada's top universities and research centers. It's led to theft of research data and information taken by Chinese talent members. Inducements are given privately, obviously, to Canadian academia, in addition to their salaries that they're getting from Canadian universities. Here's some of the things they've been taking. I'd have to read these because there's so many, it's mind-boggling. Artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, biotechnology, photonics, quantum computing, advanced materials. In addition, they've acquired secret and sensitive information that can affect national security, military technology, nuclear energy, wind tunnel design, advanced laser systems. And according to the CSIS director, former CSIS director, Richard Fadden, also includes avionics, space technology, nuclear science, and high-level optics research. So it's mind-boggling that this is not recorded in terms of how much money is behind all of this. And there's got to be a ton of money. It doesn't happen just because somebody wants to be nice to China. And these areas have an effect and are a threat to Canada and the rest of the world, basically, as we've seen with China's aggression and their build-up militarily and otherwise. And Canada is behind the scenes, is helping dramatically to advance these things in China. My feeling is we need to have reporting. I know it's got to be with provinces and federal getting together. They can go back 10 years. They've got phenomenal recording in universities. Get the reporting of every dollar that's come in from these countries, especially China, where it's gone to, what it's for, if possible, and who the donors were. And without that, we're living in a black hole, and the dangers are immense. And I think it's a priority. Thanks. I think that's enough for now.
Disturbing picture you paint there, Michael. Thank you for your presentation. Our final guest this evening has taken up extensive research on China's influence, in fact, Clare Lopez. Clare is a strategic policy and intelligence expert with a focus on the Middle East, national defense, weapons of mass destruction, and counter-terrorism issues. Specific areas of expertise include Islam and Iran. I'll stop for a note here. Iran is an extensive topic which will be addressed in an upcoming teach-in event. Clare will briefly give us warning today, but her focus will be on communist China. Clare began her career as an operations officer with the CIA, where she acquired extensive expertise in counterintelligence, counter-narcotics, and counter-proliferation issues with a career regional focus on the former Soviet Union, Central and Eastern Europe, and the Balkans. Now a private consultant, Lopez has served as vice president, also serves, in fact, currently as vice president of the nonprofit forum, the Intelligence Summit, and is a professor at the Center for Counterintelligence and Security Studies. She has been a visiting researcher and lecturer at Georgetown University and has also lectured at the FBI Academy in Virginia. Clare is a regular contributor to print and media broadcast. The rest of her bio can be found on our website. Great to have you with us, Clare. Take it away.
Thanks so much, Christine. Thanks to the sponsors of this program, all of you here tonight listening in with us. And it's an honor to be included among all of our esteemed colleagues on the panel too. My focus tonight is China. And given the short time, I'm going to be able to touch only on some of the tips of the icebergs. But what I want to do is to go through a number of the areas, the sectors of society in which the Chinese Communist Party has and exerts malign interference and influence. I'll draw parallels with the United States. I'm coming to you tonight from the Washington, D.C. area where I live. So this is not just about Canada. This is how the Chinese Communist Party operates all over the world. But we will focus on Canada tonight. So let me begin with influence operations. In the People's Republic of China is an organization called the United Front Work Department. It's subordinate to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, and it has responsibility for propaganda domestically inside China as well as abroad, projecting abroad into the West, certainly Canada and the United States. Rahim Kassam is a very well-respected investigative journalist with an online outlet called The National Pulse. And he and they produced over the last year, you have to go back a few months to get all of it, but a very comprehensive list of numbers of media outlets, particularly focused on the United States, but it's the same in Canada and other places of the West as well. Media outlets, both legacy print media as well as television, cable TV news, and certainly online. And they noted, they made a list of all of these different places where the senior editors, the publishers, the journalists were targeted by the Chinese Communist Party and the MSS, that's the Ministry of State Security, their intelligence organization, targeted for influence operations. What did they do? Well, they invited them on these lovely all expense paid trips to China, and they got to see the Great Wall and attend wonderful dance routines and performances, musical performances, eat wonderful Chinese food. And they came back and guess what? They wrote glowingly about China with not a peep about any of the abuses that we've spoken of tonight, and we'll talk about some more. Influence operations. Let's move to intellectual property theft. You know, both of, or I should say really all three of our previous panelists were speaking about the presence of Chinese, I would call them agents of influence in our societies, in Canada, certainly in the United States too. People may or may not know this, but every Chinese citizen, no matter where they are in the world, whether at home in China or abroad, are obligated by Chinese law to collaborate, to cooperate with the Chinese government and intelligence services when and if asked. And hostages are their families at home if they are posted somewhere abroad. And something else I should mention here at the outset, and that is that a number of you may be familiar with this book. It's a 1999 master's thesis written by two colonels in the PLA, People's Liberation Army, called Unrestricted Warfare. And the point about this book is that the Chinese Communist Party views every single sphere, every single sector of society as the battlefield, as the area of warfare. And I'll skip to a place in the middle of this book and just highlight to you a few of the areas that they explicitly talk about as areas of military operation. Atomic warfare, diplomatic warfare, financial warfare, trade warfare, biochemical warfare, intelligence warfare, ecological warfare, psychological warfare. I could go on and on. It's a very long list, but you get the idea. Every single sphere of society, every single sector is a battlefield for them. That is how they look at it. There's no distinction between military and civilian. They call it the military-civilian fusion model, as a matter of fact. So when we're talking about IP theft, I was going to bring that up. We're talking about exchange scientists, researchers, and so forth, who may be inside of our industrial complex, our companies. They're inside of our public health sectors. They are inside in America, Wall Street, the top corporations. Peter Schweitzer has written very extensively on these topics, most recent book called Red Handed, describing how the Chinese execute something they call elite capture, which basically means to co-opt the top leadership of any of these sectors that we're talking about. So number one, there's no distinction between warfare and non-warfare. Number two, there is no distinction between military and civilian. Number three, every single Chinese citizen abroad is obligated to act in collaboration and on behalf of the Chinese intelligence services when called upon. So when we're talking about intellectual property theft, we're talking about those inside of exchange programs in our industries, in our companies, in our public health sector, and so forth. Their obligation is to report back anything and everything. Think Hoover vacuum cleaner back to China. However small the detail, it goes into humongous databases. And one day, when they master artificial intelligence, they will be able to manage all of the humongous I don't even know what bytes of data that they're collecting. Let me move to academia, which Michael was talking about, and also those before him too. On our campuses, both the United States and in Canada, are a couple of programs. One was mentioned, the 1,000 Talents program. This is a program which, even though in the United States we have laws about reporting funding sources at universities, very often those agreements, those laws even are honored more in the breach than not. And so the transparency is the objective, but very often doesn't live up to the intent of the laws and the regulations that are in place. 1,000 Talents is about how the Chinese Communist Party uses funding, bribery, financial incentives to professors and also others in an administrative position, department heads and so forth, of our universities, Canadian, US, to recruit those people to their purposes, to report or report back to China, but or to teach and to convey the messaging that the Chinese Communist Party wants them to convey. Now, back in 2020, that's the most recent information I could find, CSIS warned in Canada that there were tens of thousands of Chinese students studying in Canada. Every last one of them is obligated by law to report back to the Chinese Communist Party. Oh, by the way, in the United States, if you think that's bad, at any one point in time, we have something like 300,000 Chinese students studying in our universities and other schools. And oh, by the way, they are not studying gender studies and underwater basket weaving. They're studying nuclear science, they're studying medicine, they're studying technology, computer, high-tech subjects. Confucius Institutes is another area. in which the United States, like Canada, has had many of these present on our campuses. Some of them are being removed. For example, in Canada, formerly, there was a total that I could find online, a total of around 12 Confucius Institutes at 12 different universities, higher level education in Canada. However, back in 2017, so some 5 years ago already now, both McMaster University and Quebec Sherbrooke University closed down the Confucius Institutes on their campuses, but 10 still remain as of last year, February 2021, a website where you could look up this information, which I think is updated pretty regularly, digmandarin.com, digmandarin.com. Let's move to Huawei and the technological area. In May of 2022, that is just about a month ago, Canada banned Huawei and its subsidiary ZTE, their equipment from being used in any of the 5G networks being established, built out in Canada. It's a great step. Canada joins others of the 5 Eyes, US, UK, Australia, New Zealand, in these kinds of restrictions. So that's a very positive sign. Let me go quickly to biological warfare. China, you probably know, has an extensive, massive, sprawling offensive biological weapons program. That is where the SARS-CoV-2 came from, out of the military labs where it was genetically modified and produced. In 2019, as you know, there in Canada, a husband-wife team, a couple, 2 people, Dr. Zhuang Guoqi and her husband, Keding Chang. I'm probably slaughtering the names, but I apologize for that. They had been working at Canada's National Microbiology Lab. They were accused and found guilty of shipping Ebola and Nipah viruses out from Canada to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They were fired and expelled from Canada in 2022. They were, by the way, both PLA military scientists, again, military civilian fusion, no barrier, no boundaries between them. Last thing I'll mention is your military, our naval vessels. You probably know that on May 14th, a audio recording was leaked out of China, a high-level meeting in Beijing of the PLA and the CCP officials. And the meeting was about preparations administratively for moving China from a civilian to a wartime footing, preparatory to an attack against Taiwan, scheduled for not later than early November this year, 2022. Both Canada and the United States and many of our allied partners and friends, the UK, Japan, Australia, we have naval vessels in the area of the East China Sea, the South China Sea, the Sea of Japan, the Philippine Sea, and by the way, the Strait of Taiwan, which is international waters. However, the Chinese PLA has become more and more aggressive in the time since that May 14 meeting took place, and there have been various incidents that have been stepped up in these last weeks. So let me leave it at that. I know there's probably a lot more that I could say about it, but I know time is of the essence here, so we'll take questions to further go into any of this that you would like. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Knowing your enemy is a fundamental thing. Every country should know their enemy. The speeches you heard tonight were very important in starting that process that many haven't, of knowing your enemy. So this brings us to the close for the 4 speakers, but we'll now allow our speakers a few minutes to either add to their speeches or perhaps to correspond with one another if they so choose. It might be a good time too for our speakers to just give a brief, just a point or two about the Iranian influence, because I did promise just to touch about it as we go ahead. So I'm going to allow our speakers to interact now. And of course, Anita, if you want to be part of this, you're of course more than welcome before we go to our Q&A. Do any of you have anything that you'd like to begin by saying? If you don't, I will actually call on Claire if she would like to start by giving a couple points about Iran, and then the rest could take it away from there.
Sure. So with regard to Iran, which is a very much a focus of my own study for the last 15 years or so, I have been working with the Iranian opposition group, the Mujahideen Khalq, a member of the National Council of Resistance of Iran for all of that time. Been studying Farsi for a long time too. I've now reached third grade after about 10 years. My teacher is very patient with me. The most serious concern, of course, with Iran right now, I should say the Iranian regime right now, is their pell-mell progress towards the ability to deploy deliverable nuclear weapons. The IAEA came out within just the last week or so with the information that Iran now has amassed enough enriched uranium to make one bomb. They are talking about 60% enriched uranium. Weapons grade uranium is typically 90% or above, but from 60 to 90 is a hop, skip, and a jump once you've mastered that technology, and once you can install the newer, better, faster, more modern centrifuges, which have the rotors that spin up the uranium hexafluoride gas into enriched uranium. We do not even know what is going on inside of the clandestine program, which the NCRI blew the lid off in public presentations back in August of 2002. But most recently, according to the IAEA, Iran has disconnected a whole bunch, a couple dozen anyway, of its monitoring cameras inside of enrichment plants at Natanz and Fordo, which means that the IAEA has no visible window on what Iran is doing, and what they're probably doing is installing newer generations of centrifuges. The agreement of 2015, the JCPOA Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, limited Iran to the IR1, Iran First One generation of centrifuges. They're up to IR6s now, installing those. So that is the most urgent matter at the moment. Israel, of course, has been warning Iran in the most explicit terms I've ever heard over the last year or so even. The IDF Chief of Staff, Avi Kochavi, Benny Gantz, the Minister of Defense, the current Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, over and over again, very explicitly, they will defend themselves. And yes, anticipatory self-defense is enshrined in international law, has been since the 1600s, and Ugo Grotius. So that's where we are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Any others would like to, any one of you would like to comment or say anything, or even ask one of the other speakers anything? Because if you do, now's the time. Otherwise, okay, Aurel, go ahead.
Well, going back to my initial comments, Iran would not be able to do many of the things that it's doing right now were it not be able to get protection from Russia, and in some ways also from China, that is protected the United Nations. The sanctions regime had been made much less effective because of breaches of the sanctions by Russia and China. And of course, the original agreement, the JCPOA, violated the most fundamental precepts of arms control. Arms control agreements have a very sorry history. They have rarely been successful. But to give them a chance to be successful, you have to have two elements that are absolutely crucial. One is the scope of the agreement. It has to be all-inclusive. And the second one, there has to be viable verification. Neither one of those was met in the case of the JCPOA. So it should have been abandoned. It should have been replaced by something else. So it's not surprising that Iran has gone ahead. But what we are learning in the case of the invasion of Ukraine, what North Korea has learned is that nuclear weapons are important not only in accomplishing foreign policy goals, and that is to be able to influence other countries and pursue your agenda if you have an ideology, but also in providing impunity for the regime to oppress people domestically. And this is why dissidents in Iran should fear Iranian nuclear weapons more than anyone else. Because if Iran is able to get nuclear weapons, that is a delivery system, viable nuclear weapons that they can deliver, they will enjoy, the regime will enjoy that kind of impunity. So whatever threat they present to countries in the region will also involve unrestrained repression at home, where the outside world can do very little, as we see in the case of North Korea. And that is one of the sad realities of the 21st century.
Yes. Okay, anyone else before we go to, yes, Gerard?
With respect to Iran, it's not lost on me that when I was a student, most of my Persian colleagues were not reading Firdausi, they were reading nuclear physics. And the nuclear deal itself, when we abandoned a lot of the sanctions after the nuclear deal in 2015, less than a year later, a US appeals court sitting in New York lifted restrictions on a Persian company or a Persian supported company that had been contributing hundreds of thousands of dollars to each of a number of different campuses, everything from academic programs to sustaining scholarships for students. And this is the sort of influence that has only grown since 2016, up until the point that sanctions are reimposed under the Trump administration. So it's interesting to see that Iran has been using opportunities when control of money is less significant and less powerful to win back some of the influence that it had in the 1990s and earlier.
Okay. Is that all? The comment? Yes,
I'd
Michael?
like to just follow up on a question I saw that Claire answered a little bit as well. Canada has had 500,000 to 600,000 foreign students any year, about 125,000 from China, a larger amount from India. But with COVID, everything's changed, obviously, and there was a lot of backing off from travel. And in fact, China was using that, and I shouldn't mention this before, as a weapon against Australia, that they would refuse to let any of their students go to Australia, which would have cost them billions. Canada, in fact, takes in $4 billion a year from Chinese students that are resident in Canada. The fees are twice as much as local students. So it has a big impact having them here, but it has a negative impact of what they're doing while they are here in a lot of ways. And thanks for I'd like to thank the sponsors and administrators and the other speakers. It was a really necessary talk. This was very good.
Well, thanks to all of you. You were certainly heroic in taking such a complex topic and breaking it down to approximately 10 minutes each. Congratulations on that one. Anita, I'm going to have to turn it over to you now to see if you have any questions there waiting that you could present to us. Anita, by the way, is on our board, and she's also Canadians for the Rule of Law Secretary. And by trade, she's a lawyer. Anita, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, there's a lot of interesting questions. We'll see how much time we have. A question that was put, why, it's towards the question that war might be on the horizon. Claire, you suggested perhaps waiting for November. I know Professor Braun, you've spoken a lot about what's going on in Eastern Europe. Are we on the brink of a wider war, not just China, Taiwan? Is Russia going to expand? And is this part of the misinformation campaign, the integration into our systems that were part of the early warning signs? How imminent is war?
Well, I'll jump in first about the May 14 audio tape. It's online, it's in Mandarin. There are multiple English translations of it by now, also online. They broadly agree with one another. There's no great difference among the translations. And that meeting in Beijing is authentic. The people in it speaking of this from the CCP and the PLA were identified. They are who they say they are. They're identifiable. And the plans we're talking about beginning to move from the civilian to the war footing this month of June 2022. And it was very specific that the attack would be launched before or just the beginning of November. And that not only Taiwan is the target, and here comes to Canadian naval ships as well as ours and others. The intent spoken very clearly at that meeting was that the CCP intends to clear the entire South China Sea, maybe East China Sea, Sea of Japan, Sea of Filitti, out at least to the first island chain of any naval vessels belonging to anyone who would come to the aid of Taiwan in order that a blockade by the CCP, the PLA, could be established around Taiwan and prevent any aid coming to it. So that automatically, that of necessity means China is ready, the PRC is ready to enter into naval conflict with our allied naval vessels. And oh, by the way, they're going to be using They're already retrofitting and converting civilian fishing vessels, so-called scientific research vessels, fitting them out secretly with naval armaments. Oh, shipping containers too. Those kinds of huge, cargo ships with shipping containers. They'll be part of this too.
Professor?
Well, countries always have plans for various contingencies, and I never believed in inevitability. Great many things can change and can alter plans. And consequently, my view is that what is likely to happen depends a great deal on what we do, and especially what we do in the case of Russia, and more dependent than ever in this instance in what the United States does. Unfortunately, the United States has one of the weakest leaderships possible in the case of the Biden administration. This is an administration that has and is taking great pride in saying that they had predicted the Russian invasion, but of course they did not prevent the Russian invasion. And that's exactly what they should have done. It was preventable. Some of us have written for years and years what should have been done, much tougher sanctions, less European dependence, providing more armaments to Ukraine to protect themselves. And at the moment, we are at a kind of inflection point that China is watching. What is likely to happen in the case of Taiwan is dependent, in my view, to a significant degree as to what happens in the case of Russia. If Russia loses, and Russia is very badly damaged, that will send a signal to China that the West is willing and able to do certain things. China is not unbeatable. China is a large power, but the United States is still more powerful, and certainly the United States and its allies are vastly more powerful than China. And we collectively are immeasurably stronger than Russia, which is only a remnant of a superpower. But the Biden administration is acting as if we were still dealing with the Soviet Union, and they're very reluctant. The Ukrainians have told us they only received about 10% of the heavy weapons they have asked for. So whatever the Biden administration has given them is always late. And a war that weeks ago looked winnable, right now is extracting horrific losses from Ukraine. And it's possible Vladimir Putin could recover. The Europeans seeing an absence of leadership, the United States, the Middle Eastern countries seeing an absence of leadership in the United States following the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. We need to understand that deterrence failed. Western deterrence, American deterrence failed in the case of Ukraine. We have the option of rebuilding that. It's going to be very costly. It's going to be painful. But the alternative is that it's not only about Ukraine, but also China will be greatly emboldened. So indeed, those plans, which I don't think are ironclad, may be made operational. But it's not necessarily so if we do the right thing now. I wish I had greater confidence in the Biden administration doing the right thing.
Well, I guess I wanted a more optimistic answer, but we'll take what you've given us. There are a number of questions around sort of, let's say, what's the next steps, the action plans. Gerard and Michael as well, you both talked about some of the American transparency measures and contrasted to the lack thereof here in Canada. But a couple of the questions say, well, there still seems to be huge foreign influence specifically on campus, but in other areas from medicine to information sources to technology. So what lessons should we draw here in Canada? What measures should we be pushing for to be in place, drawing on American lessons? Perhaps Gerard first.
I think I would say that the first thing I come back to all the time is transparency, because if we don't have the tools to know what exactly is going on, then we can't address the problem. We know that foreign money is coming into universities. you know, my college was named for the King of Spain because the Spanish government contributed millions of dollars to the school. Now, was there anything else that they did? Did they fund a Spanish studies program that, you know, spoke highly of Franco? No. Is this to say that other universities, when they get money from Middle Eastern countries, there isn't some sort of understanding that they will recruit professors who have a certain point of view or push materials and support activities that are anti-Semitic or anti-democratic? We don't know, because there is that lack of transparency. Part of it comes from federal laws, but part of it is also the universities that themselves need to be pushed to disclose for the benefit of their students. There's no legal obligation to do that right now, more than they have to disclose the source of the of funds. But, you know, as people who pay tuition, as people who pay the taxes that fund a lot of these schools, even private schools, don't we have a right to know how that money is being spent? When money comes in, it's not just about reporting that, you know, the University of Texas got $40 million from the Emir of whomever. It's a matter of finding out how that money was put into use. And that is something that we need, if not by law, then by social shift, by public pressure, by dint of the fact that we are the taxpayers and we are the people who send our children to these institutions. We do have some ability to demand more transparency. We need to know if those $40 million are going into, you know, funding a nice building with someone's name on it, or whether they're actually funding professors who espouse anti-democratic principles and radicalize our students. And the same goes to every source of funds and how it's being used. It's when money comes in from a foreign source or a foreign government, don't we have more of a right to know how it's being used? In part, legislation can address that. In part, the Higher Education Act in the US and Canada should absolutely enact something similar that requires that level of granular detail. But even in the US, it could be better. There's no reason for the federal government not to require colleges to get public funds to identify specifically how the money is spent. Universities have that capacity. They keep track of scholarship, of grants, of donations to even if you donate $1 to your alma mater, the university knows exactly how that money came in and where it's being spent. Why can't they produce a report like that to the government and to the public about foreign funds? They can. In part, maybe this can be implemented through legislation, but in other part, it has to come from public pressure.
Michael?
Yeah, I agree totally. The only thing is that Canada is 10 times worse than the US. The US previously, up till about 2 years ago, and they introduced a new system of reporting, had names of every donor. And I think there were like 30,000 records of donations. Only 3,000 were unknown. Even that was useful because it told you that Harvard and Yale and Princeton were keeping quiet where the money was coming from. And this money is influence funding. There's been a number of incidents that have taken place where administrations have looked the other way on things affecting generally conservative students and academia, and specifically Jewish ones. So Canada's way worse. We don't have any idea of what's going on. But if Canada did do something, they should definitely try to keep the names of donors available so that people are not hiding behind the wall of silence. Just as a matter of interest, the US took a retrogressive step with their new portal. They removed the names of every single donor that had previously been on their annual reports. And they were doing that because the colleges obviously have sensitivity to where the money's coming from, and they convinced the government and the authorities to drop all those names, all gone. Every single, I've got 30,000 names of previous donors, but any list you look at now shows 0 names of donors. And there's a reason for that. Yale had an institute studying anti-Semitism about 10 years ago that was shut down when they went to Iran or Saudi Arabia, I think it was Saudi Arabia, to one of the important people there with lots of money. And while they were trying to get money, they had to shut down the institute that was looking into anti-Semitism. And that's the kind of thing that has been happening and will continue to happen if there's no transparency and full disclosure.
And the other,
I think Professor wanted to say something, or Gerard, do you want to come back on that and then we'll go to Professor?
just wanted to add one quick note. The other thing is, and this is perhaps less glamorous than policy change, is private action. And by private action, I mean, people who are on universities know what's going on. There are people in the finance departments and in the academic departments that know exactly what the deals are, where the money is, and what's going on. They need to come forward. We have whistleblower protection statutes in the US and in Canada. Lawyers, the Lawfare Project and other lawyers we work with can help them. That's one way to get public attention on this, is people who come forward. And when there is we need people to come forward with this information. And I think that's one of the messages that needs to get out to the community, not just the Jewish community, but to our entire community, is people need to be emboldened to come forward and know that there is legal protection for blowing the whistle on this illegality.
Thank you, Professor. You wanted to say something? And then I perhaps will turn it back to Christine.
Well, let me start by saying that academic freedom is an extraordinarily important good, and that it is essential that in the case of any donation, there are stringent requirements and carefully thought out steps taken to make sure that faculty students are sort of immunized from undue influence, because academic freedom is so very, very important. So whether the donations come from abroad or whether the donation will come from any individual, domestically, we want to ensure that. And I think there's a high level of consensus regarding that. The problem is that this is a wonderful theory, and this is how ideally it ought to work, that donors would give money, the name would go on a building, but they would then be detached. They would not determine what the curriculum is. They would not determine what books are taught. They would not determine who necessarily gets a scholarship. The reality is that universities have become more and more restrictive in what they do, and often they have moved from education to indoctrination. And you see discrimination against certain groups, while other groups are protected. So there are almost these kind of separation, the kind of inequality that is developed on campuses. And this is where donations can work in a different way. In the United States, there is a long tradition of private donation in private universities. If you look at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, these are private universities with vast endowments. I think Princeton has only about 8,500 students, but they have an endowment of 37 billion. And Harvard has over 50 billion for 23,000 students, and Yale, something like 42 or 41 billion endowment for something like 12,500 students. So these are vast sums of money. And so there can be a beneficial donor influence as well. And in Canada, we're becoming more dependent on foreign funds. And you can see my university is trying to raise a lot of money because we're not getting enough from government. And so donors should never tell a university how to run a curriculum specifically and so on. But if you see consistent discrimination, if you see consistent persecution of certain groups, you as a donor ought to have the right to say, I am a citizen and I can donate money to my institution because I like the institution, I graduated from it, but I do not need to donate that money. And if you are engaging in practices that in fact violate academic freedom, which undermine academic freedom, and you can see that in many universities, where we see students who are badly wounded in a sense, because they are part of a certain minority or because they express certain political views. The donor can say, if you don't really pursue what your mission is supposed to be, the protections that you have on the books, there's no reason for me to give you money. There's no reason to give you 50 million or 100 million, make that donation elsewhere. And we've seen that that can have an impact, and you have a beneficial impact, and it's a restorative impact, not as a means of interfering into the university to pursue a particular agenda, but rather to try to restore what the mission of the university is supposed to be. And that is one of free inquiry, a place where various ideas can be developed and debated with being afraid of repercussions. That is not true happening on campuses right now. When we talk about diversity on campuses, we're not talking about a diversity of views. That is not tolerated in many instances. Well, that is a violation of academic freedom. And what donors could do is to say, we would like to see academic freedom. I'm happy to donate. I will not interfere in your curriculum and so on, but I'd like to see that academic freedom that you tell everybody that you're committed to, but in fact, it's not the reality.
Before we close, there's one final question I'd like to ask to take on to what you just said, Dr. Braun. And I would suspect that Claire and you could perhaps answer this because it's a policy question. Of course, Michael and Gerard, you're more than welcome to weigh in if you see a need. But let's face it, if it wasn't for certain individuals amongst us, leaders, we're talking government, we're talking academic institutions. If they were not taking bribes, if they weren't bought out, we wouldn't be seeing any of this. We've been infiltrated. Now, Claire made a very great point when she talked about the treatment of some of these individuals going to China, and then they come back, bought and sold. So do any of you see any way that this could possibly be turned around in the face of how easy it is to buy people off? I mean, I know people, a person particularly that comes to mind that was bought off by Saudi Arabia and basically preaches the propaganda regarding Saudi Arabia. Yes, they're better than Iran, but there's a lot of stuff going on out there because people are being bought and sold. Can this be turned around given how severe it is now and how advanced it has become? Because we're in trouble, let's face it.
We are. Well, yeah, I mean, we have to turn it around. And I'll refer back to Peter Schweitzer's book. Again, this is focused on the United States, but the thesis of the book essentially is that the Chinese Communist Party in particular, but others too, focus on the elites of each sector, of academia, of science and technology, of industry, of public health sector, of the media. And I mean, money is seductive, or other things. I mean, we have other examples of other foibles being used as opportunities to recruit. Government, all these different sectors. So, I mean, the only way that this can be turned around is first of all to know about it. And I don't know if you have anybody like a Peter Schweitzer up there who exposes these kinds of connections and bought and paid for relationships, but know that is happening everywhere. It's certainly not just the United States. It's all over. It really comes down to the citizen voter. If the citizen voter can be informed, and thank you again to everybody attending tonight, listening in tonight, paying attention tonight, informed first, and then engaged, I think most importantly at the local level. Yes, federal level counts, but honestly, and we've seen this in the States, the local level, here we're talking about things like districts, counties, state legislatures, for you it would be provincial, those ridings, those are the kinds of local level jurisdictions in which citizens can have an impact. And first comes the education, then comes the engagement, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other comments quickly before we close for the night?
Christine, I would just like to emphasize that what we were here to talk about is restoring the rule of law, which is the ground, the mission of our organization. The rule of law is an important principle because what we want to find a way is to ensure that every citizen, every resident for that matter, everyone in our great countries has a way to participate, regardless of where their family may have come from, their origin. This discussion was to focus on foreign players in our midst. Certainly was not meant to further any conspiracy theories or any other nefarious discussions, but rather to find a way to have a discussion about these real concerns that are limiting the rule of law and therefore full participation by everyone in our beloved democracies.
I would like to thank all of our guests incredibly for doing just that, for indicating exactly what we face as a nation when it comes to infiltration, because all of these foreign countries that do infiltrate by various means, that is precisely how rule of law gets usurped. And we start seeing it, the rule of law breaking down bit by bit with these foreign influences. So thank you so much for giving those excellent presentations today, because a lot of people are not aware of exactly what is out there. Thanks to you, and thanks to as well to all of those that joined us tonight and watched our program. Look out for next time for what Canadians for the Rule of Law might be bringing. Good night, everybody.